Welcome to video session number 3 and welcome to my kitchen table again. We're going to talk about how to take advice today because all through Proverbs we see Solomon continually telling us to make sure we walk with the wise. In other words, that the most influential people in our lives would be people who would give us sound advice and would give us wisdom. Now, getting advice is easy today. You know, if you're a new parent and you go into a department store with your baby stroller and the weather's getting cooler like it is now, it's October, and someone's going to say, hey, let me tell you how to raise kids, and you should have that kid in a coat. You know, people will always be giving you advice about parenting and child raising. In fact, before we had kids, I used to think, oh, man, those people don't know what they're doing with raising their kids. And then it finally hit me after I had kids. Boy, was I wrong to think that. So giving advice is easy, and it seems like that people are more than willing to give you advice, and often free advice is the worst advice. So throughout Proverbs, we're told to be thinking about advice and receiving it. When I was coaching Little League, or kids sports, other parents are always free to give me advice, right? And usually the advice was, hey, would you play my kid more? My kid is better than those other kids. And usually the advice was not what I wanted to hear. It was just annoying. So we need to be careful about who we get advice from. Now, there are tons of places to get advice. You can Google it. You can go to Quora. In fact, I'm signed up. In fact, you can get advice from a lot of different kinds of places. But the best place to get advice is from God's Word. Proverbs is a great place. It's like God's Twitter feed, like you get these 144 characters and God tells you how to handle a situation. I mean, that's where we really need to get our advice. And then secondly, God provides people in our lives to give us great advice, and everybody needs that. Proverbs 19:20 says this: listen to advice and accept discipline, and at the end you'll be accounted among the wise. Proverbs 12:15, the way of fools seems right to them, but the wise listen to advice. I have a big idea for us today, and here it is pretty simply. Wise people know who to ask and how to use advice. You know, it's one thing to ask for advice. It's a different thing to know how to use advice. Early on in my life, I was graduating with my mechanical engineering degree, and I had some decisions to make about the course of my life, and I was contemplating going into the engineering field. I had a job offer. I was contemplating coming to my hometown and taking over our family farm. I was also contemplating going into the ministry and becoming a youth pastor. Well, how did I make that decision? So what I did was I circled up with my friends who were all 22 or 23 at the time, and my Christian friends. I asked for their advice. And then I circled around with, for lack of a better word, the old geezers in my church. No offense to the old geezers. But these were my dad's friends. My dad had passed away, and I remember going to lunch with 5 of them, and I said, you know, I'm thinking about this in my life. What would you suggest? It was an incredible time for me. And maybe we all need to learn how to ask for advice and then how to use advice. So number 1, choose the wise people in your life carefully. That's very important. Choose carefully. Now to do this, bullet point number 1 is be selective. Just be careful about who you get wise advice from and select those folks. And in other words, just have them kind of like in your contact list of your head, that when you need a little bit of direction and you need some advice, you know who you're going to turn to. You should turn to people, first off, I think, that have been there, done that. And those folks often have terrific advice also on what not to do. It can be very helpful in your life. So you need to have wise people who have some experience. You also need to have wise people who have some success. You would not ask the Seattle Mariners baseball team how to win a World Series because they've never won one. They've never even been. So why would you ask them for that? We need to ask advice from those who have been there and can give us incredible advice as well. That's one of the reasons why I think Alcoholics Anonymous actually is so successful in many ways, because they get advice from other alcoholics who have been there, done that. They get their accountability, support from someone who's been down that road before and who has recovered from alcoholism. So that's really helpful advice. One time in my life, I needed some advice about how to get my kids through college. So I asked a dad who had put 4 kids through college. I said, how did you do that? He was very simple. He said, I paid for a third. I had my kids borrow a third, and I said they need to pay the other third. They got to work a little bit. We implemented that, and it's not a perfect thing, but it was very helpful advice at the time. So be selective who you take advice from. The next thing is to be receptive. So it's one thing to ask for advice. It's another thing to be open to it and to contemplate it. Now, first I want to say this. You don't have to actually do the advice you're given. And I'm going to explain that in a minute, but you do have to contemplate it. You do have to mull on it. You do have to consider. If you're going to ask for it, you need to consider what they're saying. That's why, I as a pastor, I have an elder board, and I'm part of that board, and I'm always seeking advice and input from them because I need it. And when we seek advice and input from others, we need to consider it as well. Sometimes we can make a wrong decision, sometimes we can make a great decision, but every time we need to be filtering our decisions through the wisdom and advice that other people would be giving to us as well. Many of you have hired expert professionals to give you advice. You need legal advice, you get it from a lawyer. If I need legal advice in my life, there are certain people, I'm going to ask a lawyer, right? If I need advice about whether that's a tax deduction I can take, I'm going to ask a CPA. So in other words, I need to be listening to that advice. Why would I say to my lawyer, oh, that's stupid advice, I'm not going to take it? I need to consider that carefully. Here's the next bullet point, be objective. So be selective, be receptive, and be objective. And you need to understand the person giving you advice. You need to understand where they're coming from, and then you need to be objective about that advice. And you need to carefully consider it and weigh it. They might be coming from a little bit different perspective or background. Your situation may not match their experiences 100%, but that's the reason we become objective about it. And that means that when we look at their advice, that we take it seriously and we put it through a filter in our lives. Proverbs 15:22 says, plans fail for lack of counsel or advice, but with many advisors, they succeed. So you don't go to one person for advice. You may want to go to 2 or 3 people for advice. A couple of years ago, I had a very important decision to make for the church. It was very important, and it involved just a critical situation, making a decision, a financial decision, and I went and sought out people that I thought had experience in this area and got multiple advice. But in the end, I looked at all their advice and I went, they're right. They're absolutely right. And that's what we're going to do. And so we need to ask sometimes many people. Number 2, and I think this is incredibly important, make your own decisions and take responsibility. Sometimes people come to me as a pastor and they ask my advice about all kinds of things, marriage, relationships. I've had people ask me, hey, I'm thinking about starting a business. Can you help me think that through? And just many kinds of things. But in the end, I tell people this, you have to make your own decision and you have to own it. I'm not making the decision for you. So if you're the person giving advice to someone, you need to remember that. You don't make life decisions for them. Here's why this is so important. When you are making a decision, that person needs to own it for themselves. Because if they just take your advice and don't really own it, they're not going to put the effort into it, and then they will blame you for the decision. They need to own that. And so when you're receiving advice, you need to think that's my decision, I'm going to own that. Whatever the outcomes are, I will own that and take responsibility for it. It's the necessity of decision making that we do it. Don't blame people for the advice they give you. Now then, in your community group, there are some discussion questions in the book. I'd like you to spend some time talking about how your community group can function like a board of advisors. In other words, how can the group that you're a part of be a sounding board for you or give you good advice? And then just talk through some of these principles. I think you'll gain great resources in the future as you develop these relationships in your community group. I'm glad you're listening, and I hope that you continue reading through the book of Proverbs. Just a little bit of a word of advice. If you've gotten behind, don't try to catch up all in one day. Just get started by reading one chapter a day and go from there. God bless, and I will see you next week.